Coming up on today's Locked On Bucks, we have some more lists to get to from the national media vis-a-vis the Bucks, and Giannis is standing among that community. We'll get into that discussion. Is Giannis being properly respected by the national media? That conversation comes your way after this on Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into Locked On Bucks. I'm Justin Garcia, joined as always by Camille Davis, and we both thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day. You can find us on YouTube and also wherever you get your podcast, free and available there, all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Camille, we mentioned on the show last week that there was a couple of these lists and poll questions that have started to come out from ESPN. One of them we did not get to last week, but it kind of ties into what we're talking about today. And that was midweek last week. ESPN put together a survey of who would you, well, not a survey. This was on the Hoop Collective draft of who would you start your team with today. Giannis came in sixth, I believe, fifth or sixth in there. And some of the players in front of him, Nikola Jokic, I mean, at this point, 3-time MVP, has as many championships as Giannis. Nobody's going to argue with that. Still viewed as the best player in the game by a wide majority. But some of the other names, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander was picked in front of Giannis. The real part of intrigue was, man, are they going to pick Joel Embiid in front of Giannis? And they did not. Giannis went one pick in front of him. It wasn't massive, but this is the type of question where Giannis in years past would finish likely no lower than third. Part of that is the age, as we've talked about. He's going to turn 30 this year. So is Nikola Jokic, by the way. So that part, you took it as, okay, it's just a sign of here's the young superstars on the rise that we talked about quite a bit last year. Then this morning, more of these questions come out where Tim Bontemps conducts these surveys, very similar to the straw poll that he does each and every year, paneling the voting members of the media on who is going to win the MVP and individual awards. So we had the same type of setup here. And when asked who is the best player in the NBA right now, Nikola Jokic, and I suppose in this long preamble here, we should point out 18 voters. Nikola Jokic got 15 of those 18 votes. Luka Doncic got 2. Again, no surprise. Anthony Edwards got 1. So this was the first time in, 4 or 5 years that Giannis did not receive a vote in that category. I guess let's start with those 3 choices, and we'll leave Giannis out of it for now. What did you think of those 3 names?
I mean, seeing Nikola Jokic listed as the best player in the NBA makes sense. We've talked about the MVP cases. I get that. I don't have any qualms about that. If someone wants to say that Nikola Jokic is the best player, I think that's arguable. And if it's an arguable case, then I'm always going to be here for it. I might not have the same answer, but if it's arguable, I'm cool with it. So that doesn't bother me too much. Luka is somebody who, it's like, I get it. He seems to be somebody, especially if it come off his first finals appearance, where it's like, he should be very close to finally getting in that MVP conversation. His name's kind of been floating around it for a few seasons now, but it seems like he's going to be in prime position to push for it. So I can understand why someone could look at Luka and say, like, you know what, I'm going to put my money on him. And Anthony Edwards is somebody who I love. He's one of my favorite young guys in the league. But that is not one of the first names that would have came to mind for me at this current stage and juncture of his career as being the best player in the NBA. And that, of everything, was a name that surprised me the most. I definitely think that his time for ascension is coming. But I was most surprised about seeing him there. What about you?
Shocked. and that was kind of the rationale that we were given to the West scout that chose Anthony Edwards when asked why Anthony Edwards, and his answer was it's his time. I mean, I don't know that it's his time quite yet. It's about to be his time. I don't think any of us can argue with that. But when you frame it as who is the best player in the NBA right now, he is not in that conversation.
That's a projection.
Right? Yeah, I mean, he is not a top 5 player in the league right now. He wasn't a top 5 player on Team USA, which isn't accounting for all the other players in the NBA. So that was what stood out to me the most. You can say if this was framed as who is going to be the best player in the league by the end of next season,
yes,
then maybe I could take that. But if we're saying right now, as in the Olympics just wrapped up, we're getting ready for the new season, Anthony Edwards is not a top 5 player. We do the same thing with Jason Tatum, but I think the ceiling is much higher for Anthony Edwards, and he is on the cusp. But it's that wording of right now that stood out the most to me, and the surprise of, look, Giannis is still in that conversation. Giannis is very clearly a top 5 player in this league right now, and Giannis, Jokic, and Doncic were the 3 players that had always received a vote in this question each of the last 4 years. So I guess that glides us into the next part, and that is when you ask about MVPs. No surprise if you're asking who is the best player in the league right now. Giannis wasn't in there. Who's going to win the 2024-25 MVP? Giannis's name was absent from there as well. There were 5 names that came up, and I think the surprise here is that Nikola Jokic was not in the top 3. We kind of talked about that a little bit on our last show. So if you missed that conversation, go back and check that out. Over how's the view of Nikola Jokic going to change this upcoming season. But Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, the leader there, with 7 of those 18 votes, followed by Luka Doncic.
Bit of a surprise. And it's interesting to see that play out in this way, where it's one of those things where it seems as if the voters are acknowledging, yes, we mostly believe that Nikola Jokic is the best player in the league. But I think that they're also kind of putting in some voter fatigue there and like, okay, is he going to really get his 4th MVP after getting it back? Like, is this going to happen? And that, like, not likely. So you see somebody like SGA at the top of this list with Luka right behind him, 2 younger guys who are upcoming. SGA was making noise with his MVP case last year. I think that's a good bet to go into this year, especially with the offseason the Thunder had, making some improvements there to their team as well. So it's like if SGA can continue the path that he's been on, that's a great answer. Same with Luka. Jason Tatum getting some votes there. If you're buying into the narrative that he's coming back for his revenge season, so on and so forth after the summer, I hear you. I don't know how likely that is, just given how stacked Boston is. Something that we talked about last week when talking about Dame and Giannis's MVP case of like, do they hurt each other by if they're both having a good year, or is it one of those things where one separates? And when it comes to Boston, I feel similarly about Tatum, especially with the way that Jaylen Brown came on last year. But I mean, I'm not really surprised about any of this, especially after seeing that Kevin Garnett was saying that Giannis is the 4th best player in the East, but he only say 2 names in front of him over and over, where it was like, okay, I see we're at this particular cycle in NBA content, and it's fine too. I mean, we've talked about it. Giannis missed the last playoffs. He was hurt. Bucks have been bounced the first round 2 years, and they're going to put a lot of that on Giannis's feet. But like, there is nothing about what I've seen from Giannis's performance that makes me think that he's slumping or that he's on a downward hill at this moment.
I saw the headline and I didn't even bother to see the rest of the context. Like, okay, we're already here. I'm assuming Embiid was one. Who was the other name that he named?
Tatum.
Okay. We have some additional thoughts on this list, on the MVP discussion, and more of, I hesitate to use the word slander, but is it slanderous the way that the media is approaching things with Giannis? We'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. Well, as we mentioned, this episode brought to you by Locked On Bucks, by Game Time. I beg your pardon. And look, we all love going to live events. Maybe that's starting to wrap up in your life with the summer out of the way. Might have been a big concert head over the summer or checking off Major League Baseball stadiums on road trips. But good news, all of that can pick up once again in the fall as we get ready for the return of college football and, of course, NBA, where you can go on an arena tour. And there's no better companion to do that with than with Game Time. It's where you can find the best deals out there and have the best peace of mind as well. You can see the view from the seats. Panoramic view from your seat within the app before you buy those tickets. Toggle on the all-in pricing feature where you can see what that's going to cost you at checkout with no surprise fees once you get to that final purchasing screen. Best of all, it comes with the lowest price guarantee where Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference if you can find those tickets cheaper elsewhere, and your purchase is fully covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So download the Game Time app today, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem that code LOCKEDONNBA, LOCKEDONNBA, to get $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game Time. And we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen of the day. For the second listen, check out the Locked On NBA podcast. As we know, there's no offseason in the NBA, and Locked On NBA provides daily basketball analysis from national and local experts in 30 minutes or less. No one keeps you as informed and entertained as Locked On NBA, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right, so Camille, those names that we went through: Shai Gilgeous-Alexander with the most votes at 7, Luka Doncic at 5. Then you had Anthony Edwards, Nikola Jokic, and Jason Tatum each getting 2 votes. If we expanded this, and I suppose that's the ultimate asterisk and caveat we should have led with.
Yeah.
18 is not a massive sample
Sample
size.
size.
And look, we don't know who these 18 were. We know they're front office executives and members of the league. They could have a vested interest in naming some of these. But if we expanded this, Giannis's name comes up somewhere in that discussion. So I just want to focus on those bottom 3 and add Giannis, Anthony Edwards, Nikola Jokic, Jason Tatum, and let's put Giannis in there.
Okay.
That group of 4, who has the best chance and who is least likely to win the MVP this season?
Now, for Anthony Edwards to make that MVP leap, it's like, what do you need to see from Minnesota? Like, you'd have to win the West, so on and so forth. You'd have to improve on your numbers from last year. You have to show a little bit more than what you did last year. And that's coming off of a really good season for Ant-Man. So, like I mentioned, he's one of my favorite young guys in the league. I feel like, honestly, even as great as Nikola Jokic is, that he might have the hardest time getting back there just because of how many recent MVPs that he's won. We know that voters tend to get fatigued. We even saw it when he was getting voted for this 3rd MVP, where people were like, do we really want to do this? Because if we give him his 3rd MVP, it actually means X, Y, and Z. Like, the conversation wasn't even around fully what he was doing on court. It was around, what does his 3rd MVP mean for his standing in the league going forward? So that's probably the one I would say. Tatum would probably be another close one where it's like, that's going to be a hard one. But I mean, Tatum was getting some MVP pushes last year because he was the best player on the best team in the East last year. So I think there will be arguments made for Tatum. The Giannis case, I've been thinking about a lot since we had our conversation last week, and thinking about how Dame and Giannis play off of each other. And when we mentioned the fact that, you know, a special game from Dame looks different, so you see it in a different way than what Giannis does. I've been seeing it in the comments on the side a little bit too about just the way that Giannis plays, where it's like he hasn't gotten much national attention for a while now. It's been that way, so on and so forth. And I do think play style is involved in that a bit. So I would probably say that the most unlikely would be Jokic. It's hard for me to go with Anthony Edwards as most likely because that West is so tough.
Yeah.
And Giannis has the Dame thing. Tatum is playing on this Boston team that's also stacked. But I could see a way there where, because of the summer that Boston has had, because of the way things have gone, if Boston does run through the East again, where Tatum's name is being brought up a lot for that MVP conversation, because one piece of it, in addition to what they're doing on the court, is that narrative aspect around it. So like, which of those four could have the strongest narrative? And I don't think that Giannis falls into that piece of it, but I think Dame could for a narrative case for MVP.
I agree on the Jokic front, that of that list, I would say he is least likely, just for the sheer fact of it would be his fourth. It would be two separate back-to-back winnings for Nikola Jokic. And I mean, if we're going to penalize Giannis, as we seemingly are, for playoff shortcomings, which again, elephant in the room, Giannis was not a part of those, which we'll get to that conversation in a second.
And also, MVP is a regular season award.
Yeah. Yep. But as we learned, didn't matter in the 2020 season and onward. But if we're going to hold that standard, Nikola Jokic's postseasons have been disappointing the last 2 years since winning the championship. And look, his numbers haven't suffered. We saw the same thing with Giannis. He was Denzel Washington and man on fire in that series against the Boston Celtics. Didn't matter coming into the next season. So I do think we're going to start to see some of that set in. And then just the narrative of, look, we've given you enough. You can't have everything. We can't give you 5, 6, 7 MVPs, even if you are viewed as the best player in the league each of those years. So for that reason, I think Nikola Jokic is probably least likely. The Tatum part of it is interesting because your point being, man, it seems like we're really trying to force this thing. If Jason Tatum's a top 5 player and he's on the cusp of winning an MVP, I just don't know where it comes from, because again, it goes back to the double standard of, if we say, well, Giannis, you can't really win it because you got Dame with you, and anybody else that, let's say Kevin Durant has a massive season this year and Phoenix outperforms their expectations. Yeah, but Devin Booker was really good. We can't give it to you either. Well, what about the makeup of the Boston Celtics and the fact that they kept everyone together? So that's a big piece of it. But also, Tatum's numbers need to take a leap. He's got to be, you got to average 30 points a game. If you're at that position and you're going to win an MVP, I'm not saying he can't do that, but who is that going to be at the expense of? And to me, it just seems like that's how the puzzle fits for the Celtics, for all of those guys to do that. Jason gets a little bit more. Jalen gets a little bit more than the next guy. The rest of them kind of fall in line. And if this becomes a Jason Tatum is the leading scorer and everybody takes a step backward, I'd be curious to see how that fits into place. The Anthony Edwards part, I suppose I would pick him as the most likely, just because of seeing his name already out there, the narrative that's building, and they have a good chance to continue to build on what they did a year ago. But that's where I'm at. I'm right there between Anthony Edwards and Giannis to say, of that four, who has the best chance to win it. I suppose I would give a slight nod to Anthony Edwards.
Interesting. I like that. Listen, the thing too with Boston, and as I'm thinking more about it, Tatum is the name that you hear a lot, but especially after the play last year throughout the playoffs into the finals, like Jaylen Brown is somebody who I was just like, is he not the best player on the Boston Celtics at this point and juncture in time? And I do wonder what that dynamic continues to be like between them. I mean, for years, they've heard the conversations of, oh, they can't play together. You should trade one. You should break them up, so on and so forth. And they were able to win a finals together after they got a team that really fit around them really well. And now they're coming back to try to defend that title. But I do wonder if Jaylen Brown is somebody who this upcoming season does start to get a little bit more attention MVP wise after the amazing playoffs that he had. I mean, he was on a tear himself, and is that momentum build up for him going into this year? And if so, how does that affect the possible Jason Tatum MVP case for him? Because as we've mentioned before, when we talked about Phoenix, you mentioned Dame and Giannis, like how does having that other star affect your case going forward? So that's something just as an NBA fan, like I'm going to be really taking a look at, like, what is the narrative around Boston?
Yeah, I mean, Philadelphia, same story.
Same.
Well,
Yes.
I guess if that's the case, Joel Embiid can't win an MVP either. So all of it is going to be very, very fascinating. It's been not doom and gloom, but a lot of negativity. Woe is me so far on this show. That will change in the final segment. I promise you that, as there was a sliver of good news for the Bucks in terms of how they're viewed by this select national media group. We'll get into that up next here on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you now about our friends over at FanDuel. You hear Camille and I talk about them all the time. They are America's #1 sportsbook. Now we have something a little different for you, because now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. $5 gets you 3 weeks of NFL Sunday Ticket. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out of market game. All you need is a Google account and a form of payment, and you can cancel anytime. Just visit fanduel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook. All right, so Camille, and the last thing I wanted to add was, we talked about the double standard. I think it was on the most recent. They had one that dropped Tuesday morning, Hoop Collective podcast, where they explained and walked through this a little bit. And part of the rationale for why was Giannis not receiving any votes in that who's the best player in the league for the first time in 4 years was, well, you looked at the Bucks, what they've done since winning the championship. And last year was a massive disappointment. No one's denying that. We're not going to relitigate the Giannis picked the coach and all that other conversation. But on the court, Giannis was absolved of any blame with the way that he played last year. We talked about it throughout the year. In a year full of chaos and change and everything else, Giannis was the constant for the Bucks. The playoffs, didn't play at all in the postseason last year. Missed time and was clearly not 100% in the postseason against the Heat the year before that. As we just touched on, their title defense season. Giannis was incredible. He single-handedly willed the Bucks to 7 games against the Boston Celtics. So that's where I start to, again, you take it with a grain of salt, because these aren't people that are watching every single game day in, day out of the Bucks. But that's where you kind of roll your eyes of, okay, we're back on this. And I started to get the sense of this is where we're headed for this whole survey. It's just going to be ugly. The Bucks are going nowhere. It's going to be X amount of years before Giannis asks for his exit. Then I scrolled down a couple of questions lower, and I got to one that it stunned me, Camille. Which team will win each conference this upcoming season? The Boston Celtics got 13 of the 18 votes. The Bucks and Knicks came in second with 2 votes apiece. Philadelphia only got 1. And this wasn't who is going to finish with the best record. This is who is going to win the Eastern Conference. Mm-hmm. And the rationale you started to see there was, yeah, it was a weird year, and there's going to be a lot more continuity. And as we talked about, all those moves the Bucks made in the offseason, were they flashy? No, they were good. You upgraded your team from where it was a season ago. So while we can criticize and say, look, you're not viewing this under the lens you need to in terms of Giannis, it appears for the time being, they're at least doing that for the Bucks as a whole.
Which ultimately is most like that. If you're going to put any importance on any of this, it's the end of August. It's a real dead period for NBA content right now. There's not much going on. So it's always a great time to kind of sit there and start making predictions about the following year, because free agency has slowed down, so on and so forth. So doing straw polls about who's going to be MVP, who's the best player. I've seen some of the comments here as we record live on YouTube where folks are like, it doesn't really matter, all that much. But to see that, there are people who are looking at the team as its whole and saying like, well, listen, this is still a contending team here, and we still think that the Bucks can find their way on top. I think ultimately, like, that's the most important view, like, to be looking at here. Like, individual awards, that's a crapshoot. But if you're trying to guess what team is going to be the best, what team is going to win, you're looking at offseason moves, looking at the roster, you're thinking about what happened last year and how you project it's going to work out this year for the team. So for me, seeing the Bucks get some respect there, especially a year after we saw the Celtics run through the East pretty much. That in itself is like, that's all the quote unquote respect that I need at this moment of the season, because I'm fine with the Bucks being under the radar. I am fine with people thinking, Giannis isn't one of the best players, even though NBA 2K said he is the best in the East. It doesn't, like, all of that. It's just good conversation. Like, once the ball rolls out there and we're actually hooping, that's when it all counts. But right now, at this part of the offseason, to see that teams are also saying like, hey, I think year 2 with Doc and that stability is going to help. They have a full year together and Giannis is still Giannis. It's like, that's all I need to see for the most part, where it's like, I know how I feel about this team, especially as we cover them day in and day out. And just to see some people like, hey, I'm going to throw them into the conversation. I think that's pretty cool to see. I don't need a lot of people doing it, because I do like going into this season kind of quote unquote under the radar, but just seeing that the Bucks were, second most likely in the East in this particular survey is kind of cool to see.
Yeah. And the rationale, the logic given on that, as we touched on, was one unnamed source that voted in this. I think they'll have stability in year 2 under Doc. They'll have a full year together, and Giannis is still Giannis. So we at least have one true believer out there. And look, we've started to see more of this kind of trickle in of, don't sleep on the Bucks. Even the guys on the Dunked On podcast, who I know I reference quite a bit, of Nate Duncan and Danny LaRue, they revisited their 2023 offseason grades on a show, I think from yesterday or the other day. Were very kind to the Bucks too, and went back and said, look, we may have gotten on some of these moves. I'm still not sure about the Chris Middleton deal, but you can't dispute the value he gave them in the postseason last year. If he can stay healthy, he showed you, all right, that's pretty good value for what you're paying him. The big if is how many of those games are going to be in the regular season. But the Brook Lopez move, again, you may have thought, it's a lot of money for Brook. He showed his value last year, even if he did show some signs of decline. So it just seems like we've seen a year and a half now, if we take the coaching moves out of it, a year plus of the Bucks seemingly making the right moves with limited resources and fixing mistakes that maybe were made before that. And that's kind of been a staple under John Horst too. He was, as we pointed out, in that PJ Tucker trade too, was very quick to move on from moves that they made in the offseason that didn't work. Same with the following offseason too. When you look at guys like Rodney Hood and Shemi Oshale, moved on very quickly from them. So that's always been the challenge with how to properly rate what the Bucks have been doing for the last few years. Is we can get on the guys that they paid the taxpayer mid-level to, but what else did you expect from what was out there and what they had realistically available to them? And it does seem like the tide is slowly turning a little bit more of people saying, look, with what they had to work with, they did pretty good.
And I do wonder if part of why that narrative started kind of switching was the Gary Trent Jr. signing, one where no one expected Gary Trent Jr. to sign for a minimum. And when he did, and it was with Milwaukee, I think a lot of people were like, hey, like, that's a really good pickup. And then it makes you kind of go back and think about the other moves that the team made this year. We're bringing Prince in, bringing Wright in, and how will they fit alongside of what they have going on. So I do think if that Gary Trent Jr. signing did not happen at the end there, I think it would still be people like, I don't see it for Milwaukee, but I think that last piece of the puzzle, the offseason puzzle for the Bucks, played a big part in it.
Huge piece, because we don't have to have this conversation, but if you don't sign Gary Trent Jr., who's the starting 2 guard?
Right.
AJ Green, so that's how much it can really change things, and winning on the margins, how important that is. I did see this pop up earlier in the comments on the show today, and it came in over the weekend, so maybe Friday afternoon. So we didn't really get a chance to reflect on it, but the videos that we saw of Dame working out with David Goggins.
That was impressive, because I was like, the ultra marathon guy. And my husband has run a marathon. And I was like, how long is an ultra marathon? And he just looked at me and was like, oh boy, like, no, I'm not. Why do you want to know? I was like, no, not for me. I would never. I don't trust me. I struggle with a 5K, but to see that Dame in his own words, like, you have to do things differently every so often just to get a jolt. So seeing him do that workout with David Goggins and also looking really human next to, to him, just dying. And everybody who's worked out before has been there where you're like, I don't know how I'm going to keep going. Seeing him just try some different things in the offseason is really cool to me. And again, just ups that hype level and excitement level of seeing Dame get back on the court, because Dame has been so adamant about how ready he is going to be this season and what last season was for him. So I was excited to see it. And respect to David Goggins, because that man was even breaking a sweat while Dame's next to him dying on like crazy endurance.
Yeah, ultra marathons are what, anywhere from like 35 to 100 miles. So yeah, but look, and like we said, Dame and Doc Rivers have said a lot so far this offseason, and we've mentioned you get very close to walking up to that line of, okay, we've heard enough, we need to see it. Right? Everything we've seen from the offseason, Dame is telling you, look, I told you this, I'm showing you this is how I'm going to get there. I'm going to show you this next season. So in that respect, you love to see it from Damian Lillard. Still got a lot coming up here this week as we lead into Labor Day. We are still working on.
Oh, lost Justin for a second. But yeah, we are working on trying to get the draft with Frank. There he is. I knew he'd be right on back.
Perfect timing for
perfect timing. I was like, I know Justin was about to say we're getting ready to work with Frank on the draft, the over-unders draft. So let you take it away from
perfect.
here.
Yeah, perfect timing for StreamYard to kick you out of the session. But yeah, we're working on that draft with Frank. So we're not quite sure if it'll be this week or something after Labor Day. And once we get past Labor Day, Camille, it's basically on that you hit that stretch drive of only a couple of weeks until training camp starts. Have not gotten the official email yet, but we do know that Bucks Media Day is going to be September 30th. So already you come back from Labor Day and you're 4 weeks away from Media Day. And then, of course, training camp gets started that week. So another year where it's been a long off season, but we're starting to finally come to the end of that. That will do it for today's show. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen. Now go check out Locked On NBA, where the season never ends, providing national expertise with a local perspective. You can find the link to Locked On NBA in the description of today's show, so you don't even need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again tomorrow on Locked On Bucks.